Hello everyone, my name is Roya, and today I will be telling you all about the books that I read in the first half of March. So I read 4 books. These were all 4 or 5 stars, which is insane because I'm very stingy. With 5 stars, I've only given one 5-star review so far in the year before this month. So anyway, I will just get started. The first book that I would like to talk about is Down and Across by Arvin Ahmedi, and this is about a boy named Scott who doesn't know what to do with his life, basically. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is the Persian rep. So I absolutely loved reading this book for like the Persian family dynamics that are just so typical, because basically in a typical Persian family you kind of have this whole thing about, do you want to be a doctor when you grow up, or do you want to be a lawyer, as if there are no other options. And so in this book we basically see 2 parents who are trying to get their kid to do something with his life, and I mean, they're not really necessarily even focusing on just career-wise. They're just wanting him to find some kind of passion and be focused on something. They've even tried to get him to learn several different musical instruments, and that didn't stick either, that kind of thing. And since he's about to go into his last year of high school, where he's going to have to start applying to colleges, they just really are kind of just like, well, you need to do this internship, you need to do this and that, blah, 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 trying to get him to find something that he wants to do with his life. And then also Scott doesn't go by his Iranian name of Saket. He goes by Scott, which is an Americanized version, and that is such a typical thing that so many Iranian Americans will do as well. Like, I never did that because I didn't have a Persian name. I actually, like, really was mad at my parents throughout my entire childhood for giving me an American name, and I had to later adopt a Persian name instead. So I never had that problem, but I grew up around people who did, and my mother did as a child. My uncle Fairy Bors especially did. He went through so many different Americanized versions of his name, it's not even funny. And so I grew up with a lot of friends who did as well. It totally makes sense. Like, Scott is such the typical Persian American kid who doesn't really want to speak Farsi in public. And I identified with this book so much more as an adult than I ever would have as a teenager, just because as an adult I know all about having to have something in your life that you are working towards, whether it has to do with your career or not. Whereas when I was a teenager, I never really had this exact plight necessarily, because I had passion for plenty of things. But basically, every kid kind of has to go through that whole point of, you know, the kind of the 2 scariest times in your life almost are when you're going to start college and when you're going to finish college, because those are the points where you kind of go, oh no, there's a world out there and a life out there, and I'm gonna have to find out what I want to do for a job and how to pay the bills and blah blah blah, because nobody really knows how to do those things when you're just growing up and whatnot. So if I were a teenager, I probably wouldn't have found this story as fulfilling as I do now, just because I've been through something like similar stuff, because obviously I went to college at some point and thought, oh no, what am I gonna do? And I came out of college at some point and went, oh no, what am I gonna do? I just loved this whole story. And also, another thing that this story did really well is the subject of sort of fast friends. So Scott, in his journey to Washington, D.C. to sort of find out what to do with his life and whatnot, he runs into some colorful characters and makes friends with them and whatnot. And it's kind of like, if you've ever been on a trip with people you'd never met, or at a summer program with people you've never met, or any of that stuff, no matter how much you go through with them, even if you get to know them super well, by the end of it you kind of realize that how well do you really know them, because you really only know them in that context. And this handled that so beautifully in such a sadly realistic way, and that made me very sad by the end of this book. It was very melancholy, and it was just so great. And then another thing that's really great is that it has no love interest. So there is certainly a sort of manic pixie dream girl character in this who seems like, you know, she's very eccentric and weird, and seems kind of like she's straight out of a John Green book, and you think that she's going to be a love interest, and no, there's no love interest in this. So this was such an excellent book, such a fun read, and I definitely recommend it. Next, I will be talking about Moonshine by Jasmine Gower, and this is a fantasy world set in the 1920s. So it's not really the 1920s, it's a fantasy world, sort of like so in the Memoirs of Lady Trent series, where it's basically the 1800s or whatever, whenever it is, but with the names changed of all the countries, etc., I could never really get behind that, but in this, I really was able to get behind that because you kind of get the sense of, if you were to see a map of this world, it would look very different from the world as we know it. And because there is some very impressive world building in this, and there is a lot more gender equality and all kinds of other stuff in here than would realistically have been there at that time. And then also there are fantasy races too. So in that sense, I felt like this worked so much better for this book than in anything else similar that I've read where it does that, where it kind of just changes the names of all the countries, etc., etc. So this is basically, it really is, in a true sense, the fantasy world that looks like the 1920s, but it's not. So one thing that I really loved about this book is that almost everyone is queer and or genderqueer and or whatever, and I thought that was just so brilliant. And there are some really interesting fantasy races in this. It has a very interesting take on fairies, but basically it implies that there are more fantasy races than we see in this book, and basically we just see fairies and ogres. And so I kind of wanted to see more of this world, really, because this is not a very long book. It's about 300 pages, and by the end I was left going, well, where's the rest of this world? I want to see more, because there is a lot that you really do get the sense of there being a lot more that was not explored in here. But as far as this book goes, it is very, very good. Also, I mentioned in the acknowledgements, so that was a big surprise, and that was awesome. Next, I read Not Otherwise Specified. This is about a girl who is a ballet dancer, but she doesn't really have the typical skinny, tall ballerina body type, and then she also has an eating disorder and is going to therapy for an eating disorder, and then she also was sort of the only bisexual in her group of friends of all lesbians, and so the one time she dates a guy, they sort of oust her from the friend group, which is not really fair because they knew that she liked boys too, so what the hell. I don't really know what to say about it. I'm still trying to sort out exactly how I feel about it, but I did really like this book. I do highly recommend it. It's a really great book featuring a queer person of color, all of that. Bisexuality plays a huge role in this, obviously, and of course there is a huge discussion on what bisexuality is and how it's not really fair of her friends to just sort of oust her from the friend group just because she's bi and not lesbian. And the fourth and final book that I read in the first half of March is Blood, Water, Paint by Joy McCullough. This is a historical fiction about Artemisia Gentileschi, who is one of my favorite people from the Renaissance. She was a Renaissance painter, and in this book it is written in verse, so it's a really quick read too. It walks us through sort of her history of basically painting commissions on behalf of her father because she's a better painter than him, and then just he signs his name to them so that they can just sell it and everything, and without anyone knowing that she's the artist because she's a woman. And then in this book, a really major thing happens where she is raped by someone who is a well-respected member of society, and of course nobody believes her because she's a girl, and there's a whole trial that takes place, and it is very, very painful and sad and everything, but she comes through triumphant and all of that. So it's such a great feminist read that I absolutely loved. It really makes you think about when someone says they're raped and how many people might not believe it, and like her father doesn't even believe it when she says, oh, blah blah raped me, and he sort of says like, oh, well, are you sure you guys didn't just have a fight? And she's like, no, he raped me, hello. So it's such a good book. I like almost cried at one point. It is just absolutely fantastic. If you have any thoughts on these, if you've read them, etc., please let me know in the comments, and I will see you soon with a new video. Bye!